Today we're going to continue reading from the memoirs of Carlos and Híjar, who, if you recall, came to Alta California in 1834 as a young boy of 8 years old. And he is speaking in 1877 with an interviewer working for the historian Hubert Howe Bancroft, who's taking down as many testimonies as he can of people who lived through the Spanish and Mexican eras. Now, bear in mind, Bancroft was looking for information about important political events, and he was hoping to talk to people who could shed light on the controversies, the battles, the big movers and shakers of the time period, especially prior to the annexation of California by the U.S. But for us, or at least speaking for myself, what we get from a lot of these testimonies is glimpses into the daily lives of the people who were living at the time, which are oftentimes the details that get lost when we look at the big picture of history. And of course, the big picture is very important, and it helps to situate what we learn about individuals. But on the other side, it helps to understand the macro view if we can have a better idea of what life was like on a granular level, on a day-to-day level in a particular place, because it also helps to understand the mindset, the worries, the anxieties, the joys of the people at a given time. So last time we spoke about some of the customs of the Californios, particularly how they dressed, and then also the way they had of celebrating with bullfighting, and then these bear and bull fights, which were pretty violent. And now we're going to talk a little bit about dances and songs that were popular during this time period and in this place. He's talking particularly about Santa Barbara. And also a little bit, again, getting into the hide and tallow trade, which was so important for the economy of Alta California during the period leading up to the war between the U.S. and Mexico that wound up bringing California into the United States. So let's begin here. Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basich. Dancing was also a very common diversion among the Californios. It took place on the day of the patron of the mission or town, or indeed, whenever it was the day of some apostle or some other saint of importance. Now remember, this is the 19th century, and everybody in Alta California is ostensibly Catholic. So the rhythms of the Catholic Church dominate, are part and parcel of the civic life of society. So saints' days and those kind of feast days are really the things that people came out to celebrate, other than personal events like birthdays and baptisms and weddings, etc. So the dance, as he says, the dance began in the evening and ended a day or two after the day that was being celebrated. So once again, They began a dance in the evening and then ended a couple of days after the feast day was over. The music consisted of one or two poor violinists and an equal number of guitarists who acted as contraltos. The pieces that were played were the jota, the contradanza, and sones. And these are dances from Spain and Mexico that are used even to this day. These pieces were accompanied by singing in which the women never took part. So it was the men who was doing the singing. The couples went out to dance and danced until the silence of the musicians, and the singers reminded them of the time. The spectators of the dance, whether men or women, stayed seated, either squatting or on some tree trunk or on some steer's head or even on the ground. I assume when they say steer's head, they probably mean a skull, because I don't imagine that a steer would sit still to have somebody sit on his head. When the dance ended, everyone present began to applaud, either shouting or clapping or both together. When the sones were danced, they were the most lively, and it was done in the following manner. A man was appointed as the master of ceremonies when the music began to play, accompanied by 3 or 4 singers. This man would get up and go to the right to the first woman. Standing in front of her, he would begin to beat the time or rhythm with his hands and feet. And he would not leave until the lady got up and gave at least one turn. Then he went on to the next and did the same. It often happened that he would find a good dancer, and then the applause rained upon her. The way of showing their enthusiasm was to put hats on her head, one above the other. When she could no longer hold them on her head, they put them on her hands and arms. When the son ended, the music, each owner of a hat went to the dancer to regain his hat by means of some gift, which consisted of money or at least some verses. The sones, the songs which were played, were El Malcriado, El Aforrado, El Grullo, El Maracumbe, La Tusa, La Vaquilla, and others which I do not recall. And according to the footnote here, these are traditional songs from the state of Jalisco in Mexico. If you are well-versed in the music of Mexico or the music of Alta California, let me know. I'd love to know a little bit more about these songs. Carlos continues, when the dance was about to end and the girls were beginning to leave, the men accompanied them to their homes, playing music through the street in every way showing how happy they were. When there were no more girls, they would go down the street mounted on their horses, and to the beat of the music which accompanied them, they would gleefully sing some sones with words which were more or less roguish. So, I guess, inappropriate in his terms. Bored with this, they would go out into the country on their horses and begin to lasso or wrangle the herd out there, or they would lie in wait in the streets for some animal in order to throw him down with a lasso held by 2 men, one on each end. Sometimes, when they were not dancing, there would be fresh meat beneath some tree and large bonfires so that one could roast and eat whatever he wished. The men frequently left the dance for a moment to go to some nearby shop and buy brandy, which was sold to them at a rather high price, perhaps because of the occasion. right? The law of supply and demand at work in Alta California. So let's see. Then he talks about roundups and rodeos. Every week there was a small roundup of cattle at each mission, not for the purpose of branding or marking them, but in order to kill 20 or 30 more steers for the residents of the mission. And the residents of the mission means the native people who lived on the mission. The Indians were entrusted with the killing of these steers in the presence of a field director, who afterwards distributed among them the meat which he believed they would need for the entire week. The gente de razón personally went where the dead steer lay and there cut off the meat that they wanted. So remember, gente de razón, people of reason, let's say the literal translation, was the term that people in Alta California used to talk about, let's say, people who adopted a European or Latin American lifestyle, people who lived in that way as distinct from, say, neophytes, native people who still lived basically according to their traditional ways. All right. So it wasn't simply an ethnic thing, gente de razón were white and neophytos or gentiles were Native American. It's a cultural thing. What type of cultural lifestyle did you live? Because there were also people who would say ethnically native, but who maybe for generations had been living in a European or Latin American way. So, back to Carlos. The bones were left in the corral, where the steer was killed until the following Friday, at which time they were heaped up outside the corral so that they would not be in the way the next Saturday when there would be another killing. At this foregoing process, as has been said, all this foregoing process, as has been said, was entrusted exclusively to the Indians, which did not prevent some gente de razón, however, from helping them solely for the pleasure and never because of obligation. I also learned that annually a big rodeo was held at each mission, not so much for the purpose of branding, marking, or segregating, as to make the cattle recognize some one place and thus prevent them from becoming wild. These rodeos took place a little away from the mission. I never attended any of them and only saw the hillocks covered with thousands of head of cattle. At each mission, there were 3 corrals, one reserved for the cattle, another for the sheep, and the other for the horses. So there you go. Cattle, sheep, horses, the 3 main domesticated animals being raised at the missions. And remember, this is 1834, 35. So this is soon after the missions had been secularized, that is, taken out of the hands of the church. Now he moves on to talking about domestic life. He goes back to talking about domestic life. And I quote, "When I spoke here of the custom of the wives of the Californios having to wash most of the time, I neglected to make the following observation. Instead of soap, they used a tuber called hamatai, or a little onion, which they called amole, or an even smaller one, which they knew as torowi. The way of using these roots was to crush them against a stone. Thus, they were able to get a great deal of lather, which was what they used when managing the bagaces, which served as brushes or scrapers. The mania of these women for washing was so great that when they ran out of clothes, they would ask their acquaintances for more to wash, afterwards giving them back with absolutely no charge for their work. Several times, at their insistence, I gave them my laundry, and when I received it and tried to pay them for their work, I noticed that they were offended. When, after 6, 8, or more days, they had finished washing the clothes and were going home, they held a celebration, which consisted of killing a calf, playing, singing, and making merry. While the women stayed at the brook, living under an arbor and sleeping in the open air, the husbands, brothers, or children recognized it as home. That is to say, they too ate and slept in the open country. Whether the women were living in the field, beside the brooks, or in their homes, they never had a fixed hour for eating, since they generally ate when they were hungry, whether all the members of the family were there or not. When the husband came home, some of the women gave him something to eat or did not, according to his wishes. So that's very interesting that you would have these washing parties where people would go away for several days. The women would wash clothes and everybody would camp out until it was done, and then they would go back home. Now he talks a little bit about some of the eating practices that they had, how they would eat certain parts of the cow, etc. And he talks a little bit, though, about tallow, which, as you recall, tallow is beef fat, and it was used for a lot of things, including making candles, all sorts of different important items on the frontier. So here he mentions the tallow, which was taken to the mission, either was melted to fill containers or was put in the cauldrons to make soap. So they also used tallow as soap. When some quantity of fat and hides was ready, and it was known that some merchant vessel was in Monterey, Santa Barbara, or some other port, wagons were sent loaded with the said articles to trade with them. So this is the famous hide and tallow trade. So merchants would come into the harbor to purchase tallow as well as cattle hides. So he continues, they were very rarely sold for real money, but generally for items of clothing or edibles. There were also some individuals who owned herds who collected the tallow and made soap. They too, just as the missionaries, traded with the merchant boats in exchange for the provisions they considered most necessary. It often happened that the missionaries, as well as the individuals, needed certain provisions, and there was no trading boat announced. Then they made a trip to some port, and there sold their supplies to the shops commissioned by the boats for whatever they needed. These shops always bought their things for a smaller price than the boats, and it was for this reason that he means the missionaries and the rancho owners, preferred to trade directly with the boats. As has been said, it was only in an emergency that they went to the shops. Besides the tallow and hides, they also sent dried meat, an article which was received with pleasure by the said boats or shops. So dried meat, also very prized merchandise. It seems at first glance that some opposition would exist between the directors of the missions and the individuals, since they were in the same kind of business. On the contrary, they came to an agreement for the purpose of effecting their brief negotiations, and it often happened that the former gave helpful advice to the latter. That is, that the missions directors would give advice to the rancho owners. The wealth of these individuals consisted of some ranch, small or large, sometimes their own, and sometimes loaned. On these ranches, they sowed seeds sufficient for the maintenance of the family. Their principal business was the breeding of cattle. The people which they used to care for the small crops and the herds were Indians, whom they had reared from childhood or protégés, also Indians who wished to stay with them, or neophytes, which the missionaries granted to them. The number of workers increased or diminished according to the need, and they were always better paid by the individuals than by the missionaries. So this is interesting. He mentions that the individuals, so once again, people who owned ranchos or leased them, I guess, would have native people working for them, some of whom they had raised from childhood, so who had raised to be servants in their household as children, or others who came to work for them, or Indians who were from the missions, or the missionaries sent to work on the ranchos, right? And it says that the rancho owners paid the Indians better than the missionaries did. So that's interesting. Once again, this is the 1830s. This is after secularization. So you have this sort of labor situation going on back and forth between the ranches and the missions. Now, we'll finish up here. He says the products which the missionaries, as well as the individuals, obtained in trading their merchandise with the boats, served their own uses and were used by the latter to recompense their workers and by the former to recompense their neophytes and nuns. So the products that they received were then used to compensate the workers. So the rancho owners compensated the Indians who worked for them. The missionaries compensated the Indians who worked for them. And he mentions nuns. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the original Spanish, what nuns. There were really no nuns, to my knowledge, in California at this time. So he may be referring to female or young unmarried women who lived at the mission in what they called the monjerio, which was a monjerio meant a convent, meant a dormitory of nuns. And as you know, at the missions, young native unmarried women would live in these buildings. The idea was to protect them from assault, basically, be it by soldiers or other individuals or other tribe members. It has a bad name because it's also seen as a way of controlling the women, or it's often pointed out as maybe a vector for disease because they weren't very well ventilated or what have you with it. That is a whole nother topic that deserves some investigation, some comment to better understand it, because there are a lot of cliches surrounding it. But in short, I brought that up because it says that they used it to recompense their neophytes and nuns. What that means, I'm not sure. If you have an idea, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.